Can you hear me? Is the sound there? Is everything working? Great. So let's get started. I would like to introduce Luke Harding, but it will be a very personal one. I've known you for a long time, since 2012, 2014, but not personally, by dint of your books, in particular via The Mafia State. It was one of the brilliant books written by Luke Harding about the nature of Putin's Russia. If I were asked who is the face of British journalism for Ukrainian journalism, I always refer to two people, Edward Lucas and Luke Harding, and also Timothy Ash, but he doesn't really write that much, and he is well versed in Ukraine. He understands Ukraine much better than a lot of British journalists. So we are here at an event organized by Lviv Media Forum. This is the project LMF Talks 2.0. The Vivat publishing house and NATO, our partner. We have this great opportunity to converse with Luke Harding and Anton Semyzhenko. He's the head of the English language editorial office of Babel, and we will be talking about Luke's latest book, The Invasion. And I would like to express my immense gratitude to Luke for this book. It's an objective and empathic perspective on the Ukraine-Russia war taking place in the midst of the Western world. So it will be a conversation about the book, about the Ukraine-Russia war, about media by and large. And hopefully this conversation will be placed in the overall European context. It will definitely be of avid interest to all of you. If you are interested, you can also share and comment in our social media. The QR code is around, and definitely prep your questions, because we will have some time for questions and answers, and Luke will answer any of the questions that you might have. Thank you, Igor.
Honor for me to have this conversation with you. I've read your book to the last page, all the chapters, and I'm very grateful for your accurate and caring telling of our story. It has, like, as a local, maybe I can have some slight questions towards the facts, but they are pretty minor. It was like, while I was reading this, it was like what I've been through last 1.5 years. It was like that. But though, there was a feeling that you wrote the book with not Ukrainian reader in mind. Maybe a global one, maybe a British one, but still you had some image of a person who will, whom you will tell the story of Ukraine, the story of Russia and this war. Who was that reader whom you had in mind?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you here. I will answer your question because, like, I'm not a politician, but I just want to say that I'm also not Ben Wallace, the British minister who recently said that Ukraine should be more grateful and complained that Volodymyr Zelensky was treating him like an Amazon delivery service. Anyway, the good news is that Ben Wallace has resigned and is leaving government. And unlike Ben Wallace, I'm very grateful both to Ukraine and to you for coming here. So thank you very much indeed. In terms of who I wrote for, actually, funny enough, I didn't really think about who my ideal reader was. I wrote the. I mean, I've written 8 or 9 books. I've done I mean, 2 of them have been turned into Hollywood movies. One of them has been turned into a play. One of them was a New York Times bestseller. But I think this is my most important book. And I wrote it, I guess, as an act of truth-telling, of an act of kind of therapy as well, and also literary revenge, perhaps, against Russia. I mean, just to explain, I was here in Ukraine. I've been coming to Ukraine for about 15 years, since 2007, when I was the bureau chief for the Moscow, for the Guardian in Moscow. And when knowing the Putin regime, when in the autumn of 2021 there were tanks field hospitals, logistics centers being arranged around Ukraine's borders, I was certain that there was going to be some kind of large-scale Russian military operation. And funnily enough, most of my Ukrainian friends did not think that was going to happen, but I really feared the worst. And I went to Avdiivka in December of 2021. I was on the front line with Ukrainian soldiers. Then I went back to Kiev, and the mood was not as scared as I thought perhaps it should be, but people were saying one place it's going to be very difficult to hold if there's some kind of operation is Mariupol. So in January of 2022, I went to Mariupol, where I met Elena, who's in the audience this evening, and various activists from there. And then, of course, on February the 24th, I was in Kiev when full-scale invasion began. And so I was doing everything. I was going to Bucha, I was in Mariupol, I was on the front line, and I would do a month, perhaps here. I mean, I've done a lot of war. I've done the war in Iraq, I've done the war in Afghanistan, I was in Georgia in 2008 when Russia invaded that summer. I've been in Syria. But actually, you know, what I've seen in Ukraine is in some ways more terrible. It's more genocidal. The Russian plan is obvious, which is to wipe Ukraine from the map, to de-Ukrainize Ukraine and turn it back into some kind of Russian colony. And, you know, I remember perhaps in April when I came back from Bucha, and I just wrote like, I took maybe half a day off and then I worked. I worked every single day to write the book. And I just felt I had to tell the story for an international audience, for a Ukrainian audience, for everybody, for the world, for humanity, for myself.
That's a very interesting point about therapy. I'm sure we will come to this a bit later. If this book if you've been writing this book specifically and only for Ukrainians, what would be different in terms? The sense of my question is the essence of it is: what do you find it important to tell us?
I mean, you guys know everything already, so I'm not, in a way, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But perhaps one thing I do understand, having lived in Russia, having spent 4 years there, is just how paranoid and strange and fantastical the thinking is of you know, most Russians, but also Putin and his inner circle. You know, I spent 4 years writing about these guys, sometimes meeting sources. It's very hard to write about the Kremlin, but my basic sort of thesis all those years ago was that Russia was not only kind of domestically repressive. I mean, if you go back, you remember, I used to cover opposition protests. They would always end the same way, with people beaten up, thrown into police vehicles on Pushkinskaya and so on. And so a lot of the stuff I wrote was about dissidents, about Alexei Navalny, about repression, about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, who was a Russian dissident poisoned in London with a cup of tea, radioactive cup of tea in 2006. But also what became clear to me after 2008 and the war in Georgia was that it wasn't just about repression. It was actually Putin and the people around him had a dangerous and revisionist agenda. They wanted to redraw the map of Europe. They believed that Russia was a great power. They essentially wanted that Russia to be on the same level of the United States as it was in the 70s and 80s, and that also Putin was not someone that lived in a kind of rational world. I mean, he doesn't use email. He doesn't read newspapers. He relies very heavily on briefings from his spy agencies, and they tell the dictator what he wants to hear. And I think, I mean, Ukraine, of course, understood all this, but the problem was that a lot of people in the West did not. They thought that it was possible to make an accommodation with Russia, to negotiate. I mean, even as late as January 2022, we had Emmanuel Macron flying to Moscow to talk to Putin to avoid war. And it was a lack of imagination on our part to see that really what had happened in Russia is that after a kind of brief, I would say, semi-democratic period in the 1990s, this dark authoritarian state had come back. It was getting darker when I was there, and really it had kind of metastasized into fascism, actually. And so even now, a lot of people in the West don't understand that what we're dealing with is a fascist regime. It's fascism. It's just Russian fascism.
So your experience of living in Russia and covering Russia for many years made you more alarmist regarding this war?
Well, I had a kind of, so my book, Mafia State, Mafiozne Gosударство, which was published in Ukrainian, hooray! And actually, which, funnily enough, some people in the presidential administration of Volodymyr Zelensky have read and read it and therefore agreed to talk to me when I was writing this book. So basically, and briefly, when I was in Moscow, because I was investigating the Litvinenko story, I was investigating how much money Vladimir Putin had. Good question. How much money does Vladimir Putin have? No one else was really asking this question, but everyone in the Russian elite knows he's the richest man in the world, and actually, he is the state. So I was investigating that. I was investigating the FSB, and my reward was strange young men in black leather jackets who would follow me around restaurants and cafes in Moscow, and I would, if you're me, you would sit there and they would sit here. Oh, so in an empty restaurant, they would sit here right next to me.
Hold on.
It was like a bad spy novel, not a good spy novel, a really terrible one.
The guy was the same, right?
Yeah, and I had, Praslushka, I would make a joke about Putin on my office phone, and the line would immediately be cut, and I would get like this. So you make another joke about Putin. So that was kind of quite funny. What was less funny was I was with my wife and our two small children back then, and we had a series of break-ins in our apartment, and we were told by the British Embassy in Moscow that our room was bugged. And I sort of said, well, what about the bedroom? Is the bedroom bugged? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, video? Do those guys have video? They said, yeah. And I said, is there anything you could do about it? They said, no. So, we live with no private space until I was deported from Moscow in 2011. I was summoned once to Lefortovo prison and interrogated by the FSB over something I had written, which was a kind of intimidation exercise. I remember inside Lefortovo, there was a glass, like this glass, and written on it were some initials, Cheka, Ogpu, KGB, FSB. And what was clear to me was that despite the fact that the Soviet Union was finished and communism had ended, that the FSB saw itself in the same secret police role, where it identified enemies, where it defended the state, and where it used tactics which were not democratic but sinister. On one occasion, we came back from a family holiday and discovered that at that point we're living on the 10th floor of a Moscow apartment block, and my 6-year-old son had a little IKEA bed with a window which we'd locked. The window had been broken and was wide open next to his bed, with a 25-meter drop to the courtyard below. So, what is the message they're trying to send? Basically, I'm not a religious person, but I understood, I think, earlier than most people, that this regime is evil in quite a fundamental way. And now the whole world gets that, but my goodness, we have been slow to wake up.
Thank you for this answer.
So yeah, maybe something about Russia that perhaps for Ukrainian readers they don't know.
You definitely feel the way how it can be. But originally we had a plan to talk 40 minutes about the book, to talk a bit about the book, a bit about the media for 40 minutes total, and then to let you ask all the questions. This may change a bit, but not substantially. I have another question regarding what you said. it's clear that Russians tried to force you, to show you that you aren't welcome by breaking the window and putting the bugs in the bedroom and so on. This probably messed your life. You couldn't stop thinking of being monitored 24/7. What kept you there? You are just a human.
Well, I mean, I've got quite a cool wife, actually, and I think they thought she would throw up her arms and say, "Oh my goodness, darling, let's go home." But she actually had lots of friends. She walked. She wrote about Russian culture. You know, she did the light. I did the dark. But also, I discovered reserves of stubbornness, which I didn't know existed within me. And I thought, I thought basically, why should they win? So I just kept going. I carried on investigating. And also, really, it made my reporting better because there was a kind of anger in my reporting because, you know, all governments, there is a gap between reality and the image they present of themselves. You know, you try and give a kind of shinier picture. But in Russia, it was an enormous ocean between Dmitry Peskov, who would tell me that Russia was a democracy, and what I knew to be happening in my flat, what I knew to be happening to dissidents, the culture of what George Orwell, the British writer, called organized lying, where everything was a lie and nothing was true. And basically the Kremlin didn't believe in truth, thought that truth was for losers, for liberals, for the West. It believed in narrative or sovereign narrative, that its version of events, even if it was completely invented, could become a sort of reality, psychological reality for people. So one other thing, humor. Basically, I can tell you, this is not a revelation, but the KGB does not have a sense of humor. The history of this region has been written through a Russian prism. That we talk about, you know, East European studies,
Absolutely.
Which means Russia and maybe 5 minutes of Ukraine and the Baltics. That's how it's been for a long time. And I think in journalism, we too have been guilty of this. You know, when I was in Moscow, I would come to Kiev 3-4 times a year. From Moscow, I would write about your dysfunctional politics. I would try and explain to British readers that Yushchenko was president and was an ally of Tymoshenko, and then they fell out, and then they fell in, and then they fell out again, and there was this guy called Yanukovych, and he seemed to be a gangster, but he was also gaining in popularity, etc. And it was, and then there were the oligarchs who formed a kind of shadow government. And I think, if I'm honest, some of my reporting was quite superficial, because I was based in Moscow. I would come in for a week, see some people, write a piece, and fly back to Moscow. And we were all guilty of that. And I think what's happened, and the war has definitely catalyzed this, I would say since 2014, this has been going on, and obviously now it's going at warp speed, is that we have learned, we have retrained ourselves. I mean, for example, I had a big fight with The Guardian about how you spell Kiev.
Still?
No, had, past tense.
Okay.
Past tense. And in 2014, we spelt it Russian style. And I would send endless memos saying, look, we cannot spell it like this. It's wrong, it's inappropriate, it's offensive. And eventually I won. And we've now moved to entirely Ukrainian spelling of everything. Even Chernobyl, with an O, and not with an E. And my most recent victory is Dnipro. Because until about a few months ago, we were still saying Dnieper. And I was going, for fuck's sake, it's wrong. And so, we got there. Actually, by the way, I don't know if anyone is French. The French have still not got there. The French are still spelling Kiev, K-I-E-V.
Yeah. Oh, there's only one exception, Liberation. All the others.
Yeah, so it's a continuing problem. But, so we have tried. And of course, now what has happened is that I have no colleagues in Moscow. After Evan Gershkovich got arrested, all of the British newspaper correspondents have left. All of the American newspaper correspondents have left. And guess what? They've all moved to, or they've all opened bureaus in Kiev. So there's a rebasing. There is I know Ukraine is decolonizing at a very fast rate, but also Europeans are kind of 10 years ago, most people couldn't find Ukraine on the map. Now, in The Guardian, if you come to The Guardian, Anton, you will see right next to our main editorial desk, the biggest map I've seen in my life. It's about 2 meters long of Ukraine. I don't know where the hell we got it from, but it's there in micro detail, everything correctly. So we're trying, and meanwhile, I've also been educating myself. I've been trying to read more Ukrainian literature. You know, I'm reading Serhiy Zhadan, reading the short stories of Gogol, reading Shevchenko, reading, reading Isaac Babel, reading Babel by Kuznetsov. I mean, some stuff is not so popular, but I've been trying to read. I read everything by Serhiy Plokhy. Who's kind of my friend. Everything by Andrei Kurkov, who's also my friend.
You mentioned them here.
You know, so I am trying to re-educate myself. It's a process. I don't think I've got to the end, but I'm trying, and I think many people of goodwill are trying as well.
Are you telling about journalists now? I mean, do you consider yourself, do you feel yourself as an exception here?
What do you mean?
I mean, you walk a long distance to understand Ukraine, to understand more than it like it's some place where the hot political mess in the late 90s and late 2000s during Yushchenko and Yanukovych time, and now you understand so much more. I wonder, what about the other examples of Western journalism, Western journalists? Do you feel that this is a tendency?
I think everybody is trying. I mean, I have an advantage that I speak, you know, Russian, okay, not perfectly, but so in east of the country, in the south, in Kherson or Odessa or, you know, the Donbass, I speak Russian. So that means I don't need a translator. I can just sort of talk to people. That helps. And I know Moscow as well. But we have a rota at The Guardian of about 8 or 9 colleagues who come in, most of whom who don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. And they are passionately committed to this story. What's a bit strange is that none of us are very young. I don't quite know what happened to our young reporters, because at the moment we're all a bit kind of middle-aged. But anyway, everybody wants to be here. We fight to come here on the rota. And I think there's a commitment from The Guardian, from other big news organizations to be here for as long as it takes, forever. I think the world has changed and journalism has changed. So, I mean, does everyone read as many Ukrainian novels as I do? Maybe not. I mean, I'd just like to say that also people have educated me along the way. So Andrei Kurkov, for example, you know, he's the beginning of my book. I had dinner with him on February the 23rd, 2022, when he invited me for borscht. And, you know, I start the book by saying that he was optimistic there would be no big war. I was pessimistic. We hugged each other. 4 hours later, the explosion started. But, you know, it was Andrei who told me that Ukrainians are essentially anarchistic, that you put them all in a room and they will disagree, that there are 400 different political parties, that this is a kind of place of pluralism and revolt. I mean, there was a popular anti-corruption uprising in 2004, another one in 2014, and so it goes on. And probably there'll be another one in 10 years' time. I don't know. But one of the points I try to make in my book is to explain to the world that Ukrainians are not Russians. And someone else who helped me with that was Volodymyr Yermolenko, the philosopher, and the head of Ukrainian Pen. You know, we sat down over coffee, and he talked to me about historiography, about philosophy, about Alessia Ukrainka, whom he described as the greatest writer ever, man or woman in Ukraine, and about the whole Cossack period, and the fact that back in the 17th century there was kind of democracy here, or proto-democracy, and the idea of a contract between the ruler and the citizens. That was not Russia. That was not Russia. That was and sorry, just one last thing. One thing I remember from my trips to Kiev, even 15 years ago, was that I would leave gloomy Moscow, and for all of its, you know, corruption has been a problem here, Kiev just felt free. It felt freer than Moscow. That was always my impression. It was always a pleasure to come here, and that's still true.
How you felt this freedom for yourself?
Just there was a conversation. people disagreed, but they were talking to each other. And it's interesting, Serhiy Plokhy's new book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, which I reviewed for The Observer. I mean, for me, the most interesting part about the book was not his account of the war, which was mainly secondhand. I mean, he was in Vienna rather than in country. But it was, he answered the question, why did Russia and Ukraine, which both emerged from the Soviet Union, why did they develop differently? Russia reverting very quickly towards autocracy and then now to totalitarianism, and Ukraine keeping hold of its democracy. And quite interestingly, he credits Kuchma with some of that. He also says regionalism played a big role. We're in the west of Ukraine, but no faction, no group had a monopoly on power in Ukraine, which was not the same as in Russia. And it's funny, I have one or two colleagues who are slightly in the kind of far left camp. And, one of them used the phrase Kiev regime in an article. And I messaged him saying, what are you talking about? It's a democracy. I mean, I was here in 2019 when Zelensky won the election, and I saw all of the Petro Poroshenko people in the presidential administration. They really wanted to win. They did not want to lose, but he lost. Zelensky came in. And I think Ukraine is going to be a democracy now forever.
Let's talk about democracy forever. I would switch to your experience of other wars you've been to, and probably you followed them and followed how the situation changed over time. Right now, Ukraine is a vibrant democracy, still. But do you see any threats the war causes? For example, like when I was a child, unfortunately, our media landscape was very similar to Russians. It means they had many media outlets coming here, and there was like a newspaper, I don't know, Komsomolskaya Pravda or something like that, and they had pages named war in every daily issue. It's about Chechen war, and they mobilized themselves, all the Russians, to go in one direction. In Ukraine, there are many. This is different, but still, wartime can cause some challenges, specifically for freedoms. Do you see any of them here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm not comparing Ukraine with Russia because there's no point. I mean, we all understand where we are, and that Ukraine is a democracy. I mean, in a way, this is for you as Ukrainian journalists, as civil society activists, as people with a kind of civic identity. It's for you to kind of interrogate and ask these questions. But I guess my anxiety would be that if the war continues and it's a long war, the sort of centralizing tendencies of governments will continue. That actually, I mean, there's quite an interesting question about elections. Will there be an election next year, presidential election? Probably not, because there's martial law and millions of people have fled. And how can you have an election on the right bank of Kherson unless it's liberated in the next few months in Zaporizhia? So probably no elections, but at some point, I mean, Putin is not going to stop. At some point, there will have to be some kind of democratic renewal, even in conditions of war, I think. How that happens, when that happens, is down to you guys. One other thing I hear from my Ukrainian friends is that everyone is very bored of the telethon, the media telethon. And people they're not watching TV so much, they're moving to Telegram. But actually, Telegram is more unreliable, and there are bad actors there, and sometimes people pay to post stuff and so on. And so I think... I think, I mean, it's the same with my own country as well. The thing about democracy is you have to keep an eye on it. It has to be endlessly renewed, because we had Boris Johnson, and the only argument I ever have with my Ukrainian friends is over Boris Johnson. I mean, I think Boris Johnson, tell me if I'm wrong, is still quite popular in Ukraine. Is that true? Yeah. Okay, well, we think he is a liar and a charlatan and a scoundrel and someone you do not want your daughter to ride home with after a party in a taxi, that he is dangerous, predatory, amoral, and the worst prime minister we've ever had.
We still have pastry named after him.
And, I write about this a little bit in the book, but I would come back to Ukraine. And Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister last year, had done something kind of, again, terrible in a UK context. and I'd be driving from Medica to Lviv, and the taxi driver would put the radio on, and there was some Boris Johnson rap song sung by, is it Vasily Charisma, some guy from Western
I don't know
Ukraine?
that too much.
And it goes, Dobry Jen, everybody, is the rap line. It's like, oh no, make it stop, turn it off. And then I'd reach Kiev, and I'd walk downtown, and I'd go past an art gallery, and there was a picture of Boris Johnson dressed as a Cossack warrior playing a lute or a kind of stringed Ukrainian musical instruments. It's like, and so I then went to Kryvyi Rih to do a story about Zelensky's hometown and to talk to his professors about what he was like when he was a young student. And I turned up, and near the university there was a woman from Odessa painting a 20-meter high mural of Boris Johnson on the wall of him doing his stupid thumbs up impression. So I have a suggestion. I mean, when you have victory, or maybe even sooner, we will give you Boris Johnson as a present. You can have him, and you can give us something small by way of return, small in value, a pastry or a cup of coffee, or I don't know.
We'll think of it.
Think about it, Anton. I'm serious.
Well, we had Saakashvili case. It wasn't that well. It didn't went that well, but still. I have two questions, but they're probably large questions. One is a pre-question. There are two movies made on the basis of your books. This book feels very showable. You know, it's cinematographic. I sometimes even I imagine that this can be done visually. Is there any movie in the pipes in the process?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's not that I think, oh, cynically, I must write a book that I'll get a call from Los Angeles and it'll be made into a movie. But what I try and do, I mean, I'm a writer of nonfiction, and this book was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, which is the most prestigious award, literary award in the UK for political writing. It didn't win. I think it should have won, but anyway, it didn't win. But I try and use the tricks of a novelist, of a fiction writer, but with the story all being completely true, so that it's visual. It's not dull. It's a thriller. That's just the way I put my books together. I don't know. I mean, I think one can't make a film now about this. I mean, first of all, it's too awful. What's going on? We don't have victory yet. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, anyway, and just for the record, having a movie made of your book, I mean, it sounds wonderfully glamorous, but actually it's a bit strange. The people in the movie business are a bit strange. When I wrote a book about WikiLeaks, which came out in 2011, and I was sitting in London in the Guardian office, and I got a call from California with a woman on the other line saying, "Hi, this is Martha from DreamWorks, DreamWorks Film Studio. We would like to option your book." And I just thought, okay, great moment. But in the end, they just took the book, they wrote it in far away. And I wasn't involved in the process at all. And then my next book about Edward Snowden was optioned. I can't even say his name, but anyway, optioned by someone who's got very strange views on Russia, quite an famous American film director. So I don't know, but I mean, if there will be films made about this war, but the focus has to be on Ukraine. It has to be on Ukrainians. It has to be on their suffering and their heroism. And to be serious, I tried to write this book so that people who read it, who didn't know much about Ukraine, would think about the situation with compassion, with empathy, with some imagination, and realize that this could be their family, this could be their fate, this could be their sorrow, their loss, that it's only an accident of destiny or geography that it's not their country being ravaged by Russia. That actually this is not an unhappy story between two neighbors who have an argument, that this is actually something much bigger than that. That this is essentially about the future of the world order in the 21st century, whether big countries like in the 19th century can chew up and devour small countries, or whether actually we do have an international order, we do have law, we do believe in human rights, and we do believe in basic decency. And we don't know how this is going to end, but that's why I wrote, to make clear how big the stakes are.
On February 23rd, we also didn't imagine that war can happen to us. It seems always so far away until it comes, but hopefully the films will make this impression to the foreign readers. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more point which I forgot to say is that Serhiy Plokhy in his book, The Russia-Ukrainian War, he makes a really good point. I mean, he basically says that Ukraine plays the same role now in the international politics that West Germany did during the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century, that actually everything hinges on Ukraine. That if this is a new Cold War, Kiev, Lviv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, that it's like Berlin. I mean, and there's definitely something in this. I mean, it's terrible, but also for me as a writer, as a correspondent, it's incredibly energizing. I mean, it's like being on drugs, but without the drugs.
The main question regarding the book and its cinematographics is that it's a chronicle one, and you probably know German soldier and then author Ernst Jünger, who like his first book about the
I've read it, Storm of Steel.
Yes,
in English.
yes, and it's like almost literally from trenches, and then after a while he wrote another book which I read already happily. It was important for me to grasp that experience. It's more about his what he felt, how he changed, and how he perceives war. It's called War as Inner Experience. And here you almost don't put yourself personally, but you have changed probably, and you have some new thoughts about wartime, about civilians, about governments, about Ukraine. Maybe, let's imagine, you will write another book more with yourself, your experience, your thoughts, like in that Junger's case. What would be there?
I mean, this is a kind of media question as well. I mean, there is a tendency in British journalism, less so in American journalism, to write about yourself. Actually, and I won't name them, but a couple of correspondents who will be in a trench, they'll say, the bullet whizzed over my head, and there was a whistle just behind me, and that they have a photo byline. They're normally wearing not this kind of scarf, but a longer scarf and khaki trousers, and I that was never my approach. It should not be about you. Story is not about, for me as an observer or it's not my story. I mean, it's a privilege to tell the story of what's happening here to the best of my ability, but I don't want to be at the front of the story. I want to be the sympathetic observer who is involved emotionally, but is also describing what's going on. So I don't think I could write that book. The book I want to write would be a sequel to this book. It would be another non-fiction book, but I have a title in my head. I have an idea in my head, and I would call it Downfall, about the end of the Putin regime. Because I think the Putin regime is weaker than it seems. That we just had this Prigozhin coup, mutiny. That it's wobbling, actually. And when Prigozhin and his guys were driving towards Moscow, nobody stopped him. The FSB hid. The army didn't do anything. The oligarchs left in their private planes. In other words, what we can conclude is that Putin is weak and really not much loved. So I would like to write the story of the final death of the Russian Empire. That's the book I want to write. The problem I face is that they really hate me. I was put in a cell and deported in 2011. Last summer, the Russian Foreign Ministry named 30 people from the United Kingdom who were banned from the Russian Federation forever, and I was number 24. So I can't, but I have a fantasy in my head that when I'm a very old guy on one of those wheelie things, I'll go back to some kind of post-Putin Moscow, I'll knock on the door of the Lubyanka. I'll ask for my file, my secret police file, which probably will need, a trolley on wheels because it'll be quite big, and to write about that. But I think the end of the Russian Empire is coming. Dying empires are very dangerous. This is a dying empire, but it's not dead yet, unfortunately.
Well, maybe at some point you can start writing this book already, but that will be
But you have to be there. I mean, you've got to be. You've got to be there. Yeah.
But it's a rather different experience than writing a book about war. And let me please rephrase my previous question and shorten it. Have you changed in these 2 years? Is there anything new you learned about life?
I feel guilty about certain things. I mean, I write about Mariupol, where I met Elena, who's sitting in the second row, but also met various civic activists who were fighting, supporting Ukraine in Mariupol. One of whom was called Anatoly Lazar, and he defended Mariupol in 2014. He stayed. He fell in love with a local woman, married her. They had a kid. He was a very optimistic guy, smart guy in his 30s. We went to Shirokino, which then was a village on the front line with DPR, so-called Donetsk People's Republic. And he called me in March, first week of March, or I called him and I said, "Look, what's going on?" He said, "We're surrounded. We're fighting. We're optimistic that we can hold Mariupol. We will defend it." And then he called me a few days later, and he was bleaker. And he said, "Can you get my wife and children out? Can you get my?" And at this point, I think I was in Lviv. I was a long way away, and I said, "Anatoly, I can write about this. Mariupol is on the front page. The whole world is watching." And then he called me again a few days after that at midnight, standing on a roof, and I couldn't hear him. I could just hear the wind blowing over the Sea of Azov. And I discovered recently from someone in Mariupol that he's alive. I thought he was lost. He was an Azov-style. He's a prisoner, and we know what that means. And I guess to answer your question, I feel guilty. I don't know what I could have done, actually, but I think the world failed Mariupol. I think to some large extent we failed Ukraine after 2014. I think that it was a huge error to allow Vladimir Putin to get away with what he did in 2014 and really emboldened him to come back in 2022. And it sort of haunts me, actually. And I don't know what I could have done, but I feel guilty.
Let's get to the word therapy you mentioned on the beginning of our conversation. Just a couple of hours ago, I, as a journalist from Babel, came from a retreat we had for our team in the mountains here in Western Ukraine. And we also had some psychological sessions because it turns out that we needed them a lot. Before that, you never know how devastated you are after all these months. For you, how do you heal yourself? You said to me before our conversation here started, you told me that you are in Ukraine with your head 24/7. You go out to your home in Great Britain, and you just open the notebook and write the article. So you are still here. It's quite hard to do this for how many months already?
Well, so there are two things which help. One serious, one trivial. The serious thing is I go to lots of literary festivals in the UK and talk to audiences. And the support for Ukraine in the UK is enormous. Still, it's everywhere. I'll be walking in the south of England in the countryside. I'll get to a village with an 800-year-old church made from flint. Flying on the roof of the church is a Ukrainian flag. I've never seen, I mean, I haven't lived 800 years, but I've never seen a flag from a faraway country like that. People have got Ukrainian flags in their windows. I mean, it's quite astonishing. And when I give talks in the UK, quite often Ukrainian refugees come, mostly women. And they'll sit in the audience, they'll ask a question, and I remember one woman came up to me and she said, "When will the war end?" And I said, "Not this year." Then she started crying. Then I started crying. And sometimes there'll be Ukrainian refugees in the audience, and the British members of the audience will stand up and applaud them. So in a strange way, that helps. That helps because it makes me realize that that this is not just a foreign affairs story, that this is something that involves everybody, that brings us all together. And the trivial answer to your question is I have become addicted since the war in Ukraine to cryptic crosswords, which are kind of... do you have cryptic crosswords in Ukraine?
Yeah, we call it skanwordy.
Okay, and I've got my kids now are in their 20s, but they're rather clever, and we do a kind of group WhatsApp call late in the evening where we solve a cryptic crossword together, wherever we are, and that helps me relax.
Thank you so much for your answers to me. I should also tell that right now we are in a space which is called Lviv Media Hub, established by Lviv Media Forum, who organize this event. The book is published by Vivat Publishing House, and the whole event is also supported by NED Foundation. So here is the time for your questions, if you have any. Прошу, якщо маєте питання, будь ласка, ставте.
If there are any questions that you would like to put, then feel free to ask them.
Although our main topic of today's meeting is Russia-Ukraine, I would like to hear your opinion regarding future of democracy in the world. Why politics became or always is so lieful, too much lie, and censor dumps, censor fool became more popular, more attractive for some part of society than clever but lying political persons. And if you believe that democracy will survive and will be leading all over the world.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think a couple of things have happened to really undermine democracy in the last couple of decades. One is that the generation that fought in the Second World War have died. And we have forgotten. We have forgotten actually what fascism is. We have forgotten that dictators, unscrupulous leaders lie all the time, actually. We've seen this rise of populism, including in my country. I mean, we had Brexit. I complain about Russian imperial thinking. Well, unfortunately, we have British imperial thinking, where we, like the Russians, are addicted to the myth of greatness, Great Britain, and also to the idea of exceptionalism, that we are exceptional. And it's partly about culture, it's partly about history. The Second World War, we were not conquered, unlike the French. And it's to do with myth. And unfortunately, unscrupulous politicians, including Boris Johnson, the guy I'm giving you as a free present, exploited that. And my country is slightly falling apart as a result. And it's funny. I tell my British friends, Ukraine in wartime, in many respects, is superior to the UK. You have better railways, you have better coffee. There was a moment in spring when I was in Kiev, and my wife said there were no tomatoes in the shop because of Brexit. Across the UK, there were no tomatoes for 2 weeks. And I said, outside my window is a market where they are selling tomatoes. I mean, it's a trivial example, but I think this populism also has been fueled by social media. actually. We have a maniac in the shape of Elon Musk, who's bought Twitter. We have disinformation. We have Donald Trump. And we have a symbiosis between Russian propaganda and the American far-right Trump conservatives who incredibly are supporting Russia in this conflict, all of which is very alarming. On the plus side, we have countries like Ukraine. I mean, you know, which it's almost as if Ukraine has done about 150 years of development in 30 years. It's quite astonishing. And I was in Bucha this week. I went to St. Michael's Church, where there was a mass grave. I saw the mass grave in April of last year, and I met the priest and talked to him, and we went around an exhibition. And one of the photos, famous photo, haunting photo, one of the women killed in Bucha, a civilian woman who was shot dead. You see her hand, and the priest was saying that she was identified by the woman who did her pedicure. And the woman was holding a key ring with an EU flag, with a European Union flag. And I hope the UK rejoins the European Union. I hope Ukraine is soon a member of the European Union. I think it is, for all of its flaws and problems, a wonderful democratic community of shared values. And, you know, when Ukraine does join the European Union, maybe I can become a Ukrainian citizen and I could get my European Union membership back. So not everything is lost. I am an optimist, even though we're in dark times. And I think if Ukraine can move in the right direction, so can other countries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. And I want just to say, when on my way here, today to this presentation, I was thinking about gratitude. And I just want to say huge thank you to you for your job, for everything you did and you will do in future for Ukraine, and because your voice, so loud, so reputable voice, is very important now on the West. And also, without any zero sarcasm, or irony, I want to say a huge thank you to Ben Wallace, and to all British people, and for your support, for everything you do for us. And just want to ask, I understand, and I think most of us understand and realize this war will not finish this year, unfortunately. But how long we can count on support of Great Britain? What do you think?
Thank you, Elena, and I, really appreciate your question. Elena is, for those of you who've got the book or will read the book, is the beginning of the Mariupol chapter. We met very poignantly in an aerodrome where she was performing with a group of actors from the west of Ukraine for Ukrainian soldiers, some of whom probably still alive, some of whom dead by now, I guess. We just don't know. But Great Britain, I think, is okay. Basically, the Prime Minister we have at the moment, Rishi Sunak, you can have him as well. He's not very good, and there'll be a new Prime Minister from the opposition party within 1 year. But he's also been to Kiev, and unlike in America, in the UK, everybody supports Ukraine. Every single political party. There's no controversy. We don't have any kind of Fox News. The danger is from the US, from the United States, and I worry more and more about the Trump wing of the Conservative Party. I mean, Donald Trump this week was saying he can solve Ukraine in 24 hours. He will call Vladimir and call Volodymyr, and he will make a deal between them, as if, this is like selling a house or an expensive condominium. And if he comes back, I mean, God help us all, but for Ukraine, that will mean that American military assistance will stop immediately. And that will make it almost impossible for Ukraine to go forward, and then it will all be about Ukraine trying to keep the Russians from themselves advancing. Vladimir Putin knows this. He is betting on Trump return, on American isolationism, on America probably leaving NATO, just leaving the European. The Europeans will continue to support Ukraine. The UK will continue to support. So, it's next year is full of danger. But actually, the good news is that this coalition, basically, Putin made a complete strategic miscalculation. He thought that, like in 2014, in 2022, the West would be unhappy about his takeover of Ukraine, but would do nothing. We would complain, but we wouldn't do anything. And in fact, actually, there's been, the Germans have abandoned pacifism. I mean, that they've sent lots of stuff. That the Swedes and the Finns have joined NATO. That the Brits are talking to their European neighbors. I mean, actually, this terrible war has rejuvenated the Western Alliance, rejuvenated institutions, rejuvenated NATO, and we all understand what's at stake, actually. So, UK is solid. We are your true friends. Let's see what happens in 2024 in America. But I still feel optimistic this coalition will hold.
Да, прошу. Доброго дня.
I'm Vyacheslav, and over past 30 years, I'm teaching young Ukrainian journalists. So my question is for Luke, whether he, during his trips in war times, saw young Ukrainian journalists, fixers, and what's his take on them? Are they modern journalists? And what does he think about Ukrainian journalism as such? Maybe there is some cooperation.
Thank you very much. I've met some fantastic Ukrainian journalists. More than that, I've been lobbying for my own newspaper, The Guardian, instead of commissioning opinion pieces by white middle-aged professors sitting in London about war. I've said, let's publish pieces by Ukrainian women journalists or historians. I've been trying to Ukrainize our coverage so that we have more and more Ukrainian voices. So, for example, Natalia Gumanyuk, co-founder of it's called Gramatsky, right?
Yeah, Gramatsky.
She's been writing for us fairly regularly. Andrei Kukov, I got him to, he would send me a piece, I would send it to Guardian, we would publish it. So I've been trying to do that. And also, actually, we, the Western media, we've had an awful lot of Ukrainian fixers. The fixer who works for The Guardian is called Artem. And it's a funny story. I rather like the Atlas Hotel in Kiev. And in March, I was staying in the Atlas Hotel because my newspaper said, look, if the Russians get you, you're going to go straight to a dungeon in Moscow, and we're not prepared to light candles for 5 years for you, so just clear off for a couple of weeks. So I went to Lviv, and I came down one morning to breakfast, was talking to the young waiter, Taras, and I said, Taras, you don't know anyone in Kharkiv, do you? Because that weekend the Russians had tried to seize Kharkiv. And he said, yeah, I've got a friend of mine who's an English teacher called Artem. So I called Artem. Artem was in a basement. There was machine gun fire in the background. He was hiding. I wrote a piece quoting him. A few days later, I called him back. He said, I'm running to the railway station with my brother. And then 3 days later, Artem appeared in Lviv, rather hungry. And I bought him a steak in the downstairs restaurant of the Atlas Hotel. And, he was an English teacher and his business had disappeared. Everyone had run. And I said, Artem, have you thought about being a fixer? And he said, what's a fixer? And I said, well, you kind of work with idiot journalists like me. You use your local knowledge. You help arrange things. You sort out accreditation. You tell them political context. You have contacts. And anyway, and Artem started working for us, and he's still working for us. He's brilliant. He's brave. We have a team, including a very good driver called Oleg, who goes everywhere to the front line. Every media organization is doing the same thing. The New York Times, which has more money than any newspaper in the world, they have a whole team of Ukrainian fixers So each New York Times photographer has a fixer. Each journalist has a fixer. They travel in 2 cars. We travel in 1 car. Their bronzegilet, their flak jackets have a New York Times logo on them, to the point where I feel slightly inadequate. But the point is, we can only do what we do with the assistance from Ukrainian colleagues. Some of him, one last thing was, we got Artem to write a piece. He's from a border village in Kharkiv Oblast, which has been destroyed. He wrote a piece about Russian and Ukrainian identity, about what home meant for him, about growing up, which we published. And that's the sweetest thing of all, where someone goes from fixer to being journalist to being writer, that you can see them growing. And hopefully, he has a bright future ahead of him.
Thank you so much. Чи маєте ще питання?
Any other questions? I will ask my question in Ukrainian. I would like to find out what your attitude is towards the fact that the Ukrainians want to cancel or eliminate any Russian culture whatsoever. I'm a teacher from the city of Kherson. My school was occupied, and basically they turned the school into a Russian occupation school. What was the first thing that they did there? They removed all the textbooks on Ukrainian history. They removed all the textbooks on Ukrainian literature, and some of the textbooks were just dumped in the office. As teachers, we didn't even go there yet, so we're not really sure what is there. I am a history teacher. Once the city was liberated, I was taken to my room, to my office, and I could not find a single book there. What else did I see? What else did I see there? We have an amazing area studies museum, ethnographic museum. It was plundered. My daughter and I used to go there on a frequent basis because there was a great collection there. Our arts museum was looted as well. I'm not really sure what the current state of play is with our Natural Sciences Museum. We had a great whale skeleton there. The Pechorsky room was there. He was the founder of the museum. Our archives were plundered as well. When our city was occupied, I was there and I was really, really worried about it. It was a traumatic experience for me. And I understand that the Russians are the way they are because of their literature, because of their cinematography, because of their education. And I want other people globally to have the same understanding. A lot of people say that culture has nothing to do with it, or literature has nothing to do with it, and a lot of people have pity for the Russians. And the Russians are taking advantage of that. They are trying to position themselves as being miserable, that they are the same victims as the Ukrainians are. So what do we do about Russian culture?
I've spent quite a lot of time in Kherson, and actually, there's a woman from Kherson who's a poet who helped me with the chapter, who's now living in London, and I quote from one of her poems in my book. It's called "The Song of the Russian Occupier." I think it's rather a good poem. I think. Well, I can just speak personally. Personally, I cannot read Russian literature at the moment. I cannot read Dostoevsky. I cannot read Russian poetry. I cannot read Pushkin. Well, I enjoyed I tell you who I enjoyed Bunin, who was a kind of white Russian who ended up in Paris, won the Nobel Prize in the 1920s, and wrote lyrical stories about the sort of lost pre-revolutionary world. I mean, I like Chekhov. I liked Dovlatov, Soviet emigre writer of the 1960s and 70s, but I cannot read anything at the moment. It's tricky. It's complicated. I mean, the main Russian center in London is called Pushkin House, and you know, it's a complicated story. But basically, Pushkin, some of his poetry, as you perfectly know, was against Ukraine, against Poland. It was imperialist. It was chauvinist, and so on. And the problem, if you're from Kherson, is the way that Russia has been instrumentalizing these writers, these cultural figures, to justify its takeover of southern Ukraine. So they hung Tolstoy and Pushkin on the drama theater, which they bombed, killing 500 people. I mean, it's monstrous and it's perverse. So I think what we have to do in the West is, well, two things. One, I think we just pause Russian culture for now. It's not appropriate to show it, to stage it. I wouldn't say cancel it, I would just say pause it. But the thing we have to do most of all is to not program Ukrainian writers and Russian writers in Paris or Berlin and New York and hope that if they're on the same platform, they can talk to each other and this will bring about peace. That's not going to bring about peace. What's going to bring about peace is F-16s, long-range artillery, better tanks, and, you know, Ukrainian victory on the battlefield. This is not a time for dialogue. This is a time for military action. So culture is so important. The square I am in Kiev, where I'm normally based, there was a very mediocre gold statue to a Soviet pilot called Kharkov, I think. Yes, okay. So 3 months ago, it disappeared. He's gone. He's gone. And there was another statue, rather a good statue, to Zoya Kamadiniansky. Yeah, of this kind of flowing woman in silver. In the other square, that's also disappeared. I mean, from an aesthetic point of view, I prefer Zoya, but I can see where she has to go. And you have to do this. We have to support you. And maybe at some point in the future, Russian culture can come back, but not now.
Any other questions?
Luke, my first word for you is the word of gratitude, because what I've been observing a lot recently is that we get some international support and we get some international experts from all fields coming to Ukraine and providing support, and then they say, but you have beautiful experts of your own, they can do training or whatever they can do themselves, and the answer would usually be, no, but you are a foreign expert, they will listen to you, not us locals. So I would like to say thank you for being a foreign expert who is listened to by foreign audiences, also who has the voice here in Ukraine and also has this unique, genuine view of what is happening around. So thank you, it's hugely appreciated. And my question to you is, okay, we figured out that the war is not ending this year, but it is ending and we are winning it. I do hope that everyone is sure about that. So what do you see as the biggest challenge for Ukrainian nation after the war is over? And is there any lesson that we can borrow from the UK people that could help us? Thank you.
Olga, thank you very much. Great to see you. Thank you for coming. Peace feels a long way off, but it will come. And I wonder whether the experience in Ukraine might be similar to what happened in the UK after the Second World War. We had Winston Churchill, who was a great wartime leader, and I write, semi-seriously about Volodymyr Zelensky, describing him as Churchill with an iPhone. To my mind, the only politician in the Western world who can successfully and plausibly talk into an iPhone without looking like an idiot. He can do it. He has extraordinary charisma, storytelling power, communication skills. He's taken everything from acting into this existential moment for Ukraine. But I wonder whether maybe he's not the president for the peace. That actually the greatest service he could do after winning the war is to leave politics and hand over to someone else. And what happened in the UK, much to everyone's surprise, was that after the war was won, there was a general election, and this rather boring, technocratic, grey, bald man called Clement Attlee beat Winston Churchill, the man who delivered victory, but then actually ushered in a series of reforms, including setting up the British National Health Service, which is free, still free, just about. It's in trouble, but it still works. And introduced the idea of universal social benefits, proper pensions, proper healthcare. So Zelensky is clearly the leader for war, but if he can actually not stay in power forever, leave power, let someone else take over and drive this country forward, I think that would be a great service. And I guess the other thing is reconstruction. There's going to be billions of dollars which is going to pour into Ukraine to rebuild areas that have been destroyed, to demine the whole south of the country and so on. It would be very good if that money is not stolen and is actually used correctly. What gives me hope is that civil society in Ukraine is so lively, it's so vigilant, it's so active. I can't see Ukraine going back to the kind of mafia Yanukovych style government. I think if that's to happen, there will be another Maidan immediately. Not in 5 days, but in 5 minutes. So I'm optimistic, but it would be good if Zelensky leaves the stage with a final beautiful bow and someone else appears, preferably a woman.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I wonder what he thinks of this. But this is it. We'll wrap up our meeting. I would like to thank first of all to our translators who enabled understanding each other way better. I thank to Lviv Media Forum and Vivat who also organized this meeting and co-hosted by this book. Thank you, our guests, our audience, for relevant and thoughtful questions. And thank you, Luke, for carrying of us, taking...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Героям слава. І якщо ви хочете підписати книжку, то...
If you want to get a signed copy of the book, or if you want to have your copy of the book signed, you can approach Luke.
I really enjoyed it. Yes.